Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Welcome to Sci Fi Saturday. Today we're reading part 2 of The Flying Saucers Are Real by Donald Kehoe. This is a true story, and Donald Kehoe investigated numerous encounters between the United States Air Force and UFOs between 1947 and 1950. He states that Earth has been visited by extraterrestrials for 2 centuries, with the frequencies of these visits increasing sharply after the first atomic weapon tests. Citing anecdotal evidence, he believes the Air Force may have attained and adapted some alien technology, its method of propulsion, and perhaps its source of power. So join us today as Justin King reads The Flying Saucers Are Real on Sci Fi Saturday, only on The Hidden Corners.
Chapter 6. Shortly after my talk with Steele, I flew to the coast. For 3 weeks, I investigated sightings that had been reported by airline and private pilots and other competent witnesses. At first, the airline pilots were reluctant to talk. Most of them remembered the ridicule that had followed published accounts by other airline men. One pilot told me he had been ordered to keep still about his experience. Whether by the company or the Air Force, he would not say. But most of them finally agreed to talk if I kept their names out of print. One airline captain, I'll call him Blake, had encountered a saucer at night. He and his co-pilot had sighted the object gleaming in the moonlight, half a mile to their left. "We were at about 12,000 feet, he said, when we saw this thing pacing us. It didn't have any running lights, but we could see the moonlight reflecting from something like bright metal. There was a glow along the side like some kind of light or exhaust. Can you make out the shape?" I asked. Blake grinned crookedly. "You think we didn't try? I cut in toward it. It turned in the same direction. I pulled up about 300 feet and it did the same. Finally, I opened my throttles and cut in fast, intending to pull tip if we got too close. I needn't have worried. The thing let out a burst of reddish flame and streaked up out of sight. It was gone in a few seconds." "Then it must have been piloted," I said. "If not, it had some kind of radar responder unit to make it veer off when anything got near it. It matched every move I made until the last one." I asked him what he thought the saucer was. Blake hesitated, then he gave me a slow grin. "Well, my co-pilot thinks it was a spaceship. He says no pilots here on Earth could take that many G's when the thing zoomed." I had heard some men from Mars' opinions about the saucers, but this was an experienced pilot. "You don't believe that?" I said. "No," Blake said. "I figured it was some new type of guided missile. If it took as many G's as Chuck, my co-pilot, thinks, then it must have been on a beam and remote-controlled." Later I found out 2 other pilots who had the same idea as Chuck. One captain was afraid the flying saucers were Russian. His co-pilot thought they were Air Force or Navy. I met one airline official who was indignant about testing such missiles near the airways. "Even if they do have some device to make them veer off," he said, "I think it's a risk. They'll be held to pay if one ever hits an airliner." "They've been flying around for 2 years, a line pilot pointed out. "Nobody's had a close call yet. I don't think there's much danger." When I left the coast, I flew to New York. Ken Purdy called in John Dewberry, True's aviation editor, to hear the details. Purdy called him John the Skeptic. After I told him what I had learned, Purdy nodded. "What do you think the saucers are?" asked Dewberry. "They must be guided missiles," I said, "but it leaves some unusual gaps in the pictures." I had made up a list of possible answers and I read it to them. 1. The saucers don't exist. They're caused by mistakes, hysteria, and so on. 2. They're Russian-guided missiles. 3. They're American-guided missiles. 4. The whole thing is a hoax, a psychological warfare trick. "You made a trick of ours," said Purdy. "Sure, to make the Soviets think we could reach them with a guided missile. But I don't think that's the answer. I just listed it as a possibility." Dewberry considered this thoughtfully. "In the first place, you'd have to bring thousands of people into the scheme, so the discs would be reported often enough to get publicity. You'd have to have some kind of device, maybe something launched from high-flying bombers, to give the rumors substance. They'd certainly do a better job than this to put it over, and it wouldn't explain the worldwide sightings. Also, Captain Mantell wouldn't kill himself just to carry out an official hoax.
John's right, said Purdy. Anyway, it's too ponderous. It would leak like a sieve, and the dumbest Soviet agent would see through it.
He looked back at my list. Cross off number 1. There's too much competent testimony, beside the obvious fact that something's been covered up. That leaves Russian or American missiles, I said, as Steele first suggested. But there are some points that just don't fit the missile theory.
You left out one answer, said Purdy.
What's that?
Interplanetary.
You're kidding, I said.
I didn't say I believed it, said Purdy. I just say it's possible.
Dewberry was watching me. I know how you feel. That's how it hit me when Ken first said it.
I've heard it before, I said, but I never took it seriously. Maybe this'll interest you, Purdy said. He gave me a note from Sam Bowl. Just talked with D, the note ran. D is a prominent aeronautical engineer, the designer of a world-famous plane. He believes the discs may be interplanetary and that the Air Force knows it, or at least suspects it. I'm enclosing sketches showing how he thinks the discs operate. He's not the first who told us that, said Purdy. We've heard the same thing from other engineers, but a dozen airline pilots think that they're coming from outer space. And that there's a rocket expert at Wright Field who's warned Project Saucer that the things are interplanetary. That's why I'm not writing it off.
Have you read the Project Saucer ideas on space travel? Dewberry asked me.
I told him my copy hadn't reached me.
He read me some marked paragraphs in his copy of the preliminary report. There has been speculation that the aerial phenomena might actually be some form of penetration from another planet. The existence of intelligent life on Mars is not impossible, but is completely unproven. The possibility of intelligent life on the planet Venus is not considered completely unreasonable by astronomers. Scientists concede that living organisms might develop in chemical environments which are strange to us. In the next 50 years, we will almost certainly start exploring space. The chance of space travelers existing at planets attached to neighboring stars is very much greater than the chance of space-traveling Martians. The one can be viewed as almost a certainty. Dewberry handed me the report. Here, I practically know it by heart. Take it with you. You can send it back later.
I know the space travel idea sounds silly at first, said Purdy, but it's the only answer that explains all the sightings, especially those in the last century.
He asked Dewberry to give me their file of historic reports.
While John was getting it, Purdy went on. Be careful about this man Steele. After what he said about moral responsibility, I'm sure he's planted. I thought back to Steele's warning. I told Purdy, if he had the space thing in mind, maybe he's right. It could set off a panic that would make the Orson Welles thing look like a picnic. Certainly it would, Purdy said. We'd have to handle it carefully if it turned out to be the truth. But I think the Air Force is making a mistake if that's what they're hiding. It could break the wrong way and be serious.
John Dewberry came back with a file of old reports. It might interest you to know, he said, that the Air Force checked all those old sightings too.
The idea was still a difficult one for me to believe. These space travel suggestions might be a trick, I said. The Air Force may be hinting at that to hide the guided missile secret. Yes, but later on they deny the space thing, said Purdy. It looks as if they're trying to put people on guard and then play it down so they won't be scared.
As I put the historic reports file in my briefcase, Purdy handed me a letter from an investigator named Hilton, who had been working in the Southwest. I skimmed over his letter. Hilton had heard of some unusual night sightings in New Mexico. The story had been hushed up, but he had learned some details from a pilot at Albuquerque. One of these mysterious flying lights had been seen in Las Vegas on December 8th of 1948, just 1 month before Mantell was killed in Kentucky. It was too dark to make out the shape behind the light, but all witnesses had agreed on its performance. The thing had climbed at tremendous speed, its upward motion shown by a bright green light. Though the green glow was much brighter than a plane's running light, all plane schedules were carefully checked. I think they were trying to pin it on a jet freighter, the Albuquerque pilot told Hilton. But there weren't any jets near here. Anyway, the thing climbed too fast. It must have been making close to 900 miles an hour. The Air Force had also checked balloon release times, apparently just for the record. since no balloon could even approach the saucer's terrific descent. Again, they drew a blank. "And the way this is hushed up," Hilton commented, "they seem to be worried about this group of sightings. I've heard 2 reports that the FBI is tied into the deal somehow, but that's as far as I can get. See if you can get any lead on that," Purdy told me. "That FBI business puzzles me. Where would they come in?" I said I would try to find out, but it was almost 4 months before we learned the answer. The FBI men had been witnesses. This was later admitted in an obscure cross-reference in the final Project Saucer report. But all official answers to the strange green light sightings had been carefully omitted. The cases concerned were 223, 224, 225, 226, 227, 230, and 231, which will be discussed later. "When you go back to Washington," said Purdy, "see what reaction you get to the interplanetary idea." I had a pretty good idea what the reaction would be, but I nodded. "Okay, I'll go flag a spaceship and be on my way." "Okay, gag it up," said Purdy, "but don't sell it short. If by any chance it's true, it'll be the biggest story since the birth of Christ." Chapter 7. It was dark when the airliner limousine reached LaGuardia Field. I had intended taking an earlier plane, but Dewberry persuaded me to stay over for dinner. We dropped into the Alcanon, next door to the True Office's building. Halfway through dinner, I asked John what he thought of the space travel answer. "Oh, it's possible," he said cautiously. "The time and space angles make it hard to fake. But if we're planning to explore space within 50 years, there's no reason some other planet people couldn't do it. Of course, if they've been observing us for over a century, as those old sightings seem to indicate, they must be far ahead of us, at least in technical progress." Later on, he said thoughtfully, "Even though it's possible, I hate to think it's the answer. Just imagine the impact on the world. We'd have to reorient our whole lives, but things are complicated enough already." Standing at the gate, waiting for my plane to be called, I thought over that angle. Assuming that space travel was a solution, which I still couldn't believe, what would be the effect on the world? It was a hard thing to picture. So much depended on the visitors from space. What would their purpose be? Would they be peaceful or hostile? Why had they been observing the Earth so intensively in the past few years? I could think of 100 questions. What would the space people be like? Would they be similar to men and women on Earth? Or some fearsome buck-rogerous creatures who would terrify the average American, including myself? It was obvious they would be far superior to us in many ways. But their civilization might be entirely different. Evolution might have developed their minds and possibly their bodies, along with lines we couldn't even grasp. Perhaps we couldn't even communicate with them. What would be the net effect of making contact with beings from a distant planet? Would Earthlings be terrified, or if it seemed the peaceful exploration, would we be intrigued by the thought of a great adventure? It would depend entirely on the space visitors' motives, and how the world is prepared for such a revelation. The more I thought about it, the more fantastic the thing seemed. And yet it had been too long since airplane flight was considered an idiot's dream. This scene here at LaGuardia would have seemed pure fantasy in 1900. The huge constellations and DC-6s, the double-deck Stratocruisers sweeping in from all over the country, the big ships at Pan American, taking off for points all over the globe. We'd come a long way in the 46 years since the Wright brothers' first flight. But space travel... The gateman checked my ticket and I went out of the Washington plane. It was a luxury ship, a 52-passenger, 4-engine DC-6, scheduled to be in the capital 1 hour after takeoff. By morning this plane, the Aztec, would be in Mexico City. The couple going up the gangway ahead of me were in their late 60s. 50 years ago, what would they have said if someone had predicted this flight? The answer to that was easy. At that time, high school songbooks featured a well-known piece entitled Darius Green and His Flying Machine. Darius, it seems, was a simple-minded lad who actually thought he could fly. 50 years. That was the time the Air Force had estimated it would take us to start exploring space. Would Americans come to accept space travel as matter-of-factly as the people now boarding this plane? The youngsters would, probably. The older ones, as a rule, would be a little more cautious. In the oval lounge at the rear of the plane, I took out the file of old sighting reports. Glancing through it, I saw excerpts from 19th century astronomical and scientific journals, and extracts from official gazettes. Most of the early sightings have been in Great Britain and on the continent, with a few reports scattered around the world. The American reports did not begin until the latter part of the century. The DC-6 rolled out and took off. For a few minutes, I watched the lights of Manhattan and Greater New York twinkling below. The Empire State Building tower was still above us, as the plane banked over the East River. We climbed quickly, and the familiar outline of Manhattan took shape like a map pinpointed with millions of lights. Any large city seen from the air at night had a certain magic. New York most of all. Looking down, I thought, what would a spaceman think seeing this brilliantly lighted city, the towering skyscrapers? Would other planets have such cities, or would it be something new and puzzling to a visitor from space? Turning back to the old reports, I skipped through until I found the American sightings. One of the first was an incident at Bonham, Texas, in the summer of 1873. It was broad daylight when a strange, fast-moving object appeared in the sky southwest of the town. For a moment, the people of Bonham stared at the thing, not believing their eyes. The only flying device they'd known was a drifting balloon. But this thing was tremendous, and speeding so fast, its outlines were almost a blur. Terrified farmers dived under their wagons. Townspeople fled indoors. Only a few hardy souls remained in the streets. The mysterious object circled Bonham twice, then raced off to the cast and vanished. Descriptions of the strange machine varied from round or oval to cigar-shaped. The details of the Bonham sighting were later confirmed for me by Frank Edwards, Mutual Network newscaster who investigated this case. 24 hours after the Bonham incident, a device of the same description appeared at Fort Scott, Kansas. Panic-stricken soldiers fled the parade ground as the thing flashed overhead. In a few seconds it disappeared, circling toward the north. Until now, I had supposed that the term saucer was original with Kenneth Arnold. Actually, the first to compare a flying object with a saucer was John Martin, a farmer who lived near Denison, Texas. The Denison Daily News of January 25th of 1878 gives the following account. From Mr. John Martin, a farmer who lives some 6 miles south of the city, we learn the following strange story. Tuesday morning, while out hunting, his attention was directed to a dark object high up in the southern sky. The peculiar shape and velocity with which the object seemed to approach riveted his attention, and he strained his eyes to discover its character. When first noticed, it appeared to be about the size of an orange, which continued to grow in size. After gazing at it for some time, Mr. Martin became blind from long looking, and left off viewing it for a time in order to rest his eyes. On resuming his view, the object was almost overhead, and had increased considerably in size, and appeared to be going through space at wonderful speed. When directly over him, it was about the size of a large saucer, and was evidently a great height. Mr. Martin thought it resembled, as well as he could judge, a balloon. It went as rapidly as it had come, and was soon lost to sight in the heavenly skies. Mr. Martin is a gentleman of undoubted veracity, and the strange occurrence, if it was not a balloon, deserves the attention of our scientists. In the file, I saw a memo DuBarry had written. I would take the very early reports with caution. For instance, the one of August 9th of 1762, which describes an odd spindle-shaped body traveling at high speed toward the sun. I recall that Charles Fort accepted this along with other early sightings as evidence of spaceships. But this particular thing might have been a meteor. Meteors as such were almost unknown then. The later reports are more convincing, and it is also easier to check the sources, especially those from 1870 on. From 1762 to 1870, the reports were meager. Some described mysterious lights in the sky. A few mentioned round objects seen in daylight. Even though they were not so fully documented as later ones, one point struck me. In those days, there was no telegraph, telephone, or radio to spread news rapidly and start a flood of rumors. A sighting in Scotland could not be the cause of a similar one 2 days later in the south of France. Beginning in 1870, there was a series of reports that went on to the turn of the century. In the London Times, September 26 of 1870, there was a description of an unusual object that was seen crossing the moon. It was reported as elliptical, with some kind of tail, and it took almost 30 seconds to complete its passage of the moon. Then in 1871, a large round body was sighted at Marseille, France. This was on August 1st. It moved slowly across the sky, apparently at great height, and was visible for about 15 minutes. On March 22nd of 1880, several brilliantly luminous objects were reported seen in Cantonau, Germany. Sighted just before sunrise, they were described as rising from the horizon and moving from east to west. The account was published in the British Nature magazine, volume 22, page 64. The next report in the file mentioned briefly a strange round object seen in the skies over Bermuda. The source for this account was the Bermuda Royal Gazette. This was in 1885. That same year, an astronomer and other witnesses reported a gigantic aerial object at Adrianople, Turkey. On November 1st, the weird apparition was seen moving across the sky. Observers described it as round and 4 to 5 times the size of the moon. This estimate is similar to the Denison, Texas comparison with an orange. The object would actually be huge to be seen at any great height, but unless a true height were known, any estimate of size would be guesswork. On March 19th of 1887, 2 strange objects fell into the sea near Dutch Barkentine. As described by the skipper, Captain C.D. Sweet, one of the objects was dark, the other was brightly luminous. The glowing object fell with a loud roaring sound. The shipmaster was positive it was not a meteor. In New Zealand, a year later, an oval-shaped disc was reported speeding high overhead. This was on May 4th of 1888. About 2 years after this, several large aerial bodies were sighted hovering over the Dutch East Indies. Most accounts describe them as roughly triangular, about 100 feet at the base and 200 feet on the sides. But some observers thought they might be longer and narrower. With a rounded base, this would make them agree with more recent stories of cone-shaped objects with rounded tops, seen in American skies. On August 26, 1894, a British admiral reported sighting a large disk with a projection like a tail. And a year after this, both England and Scotland buzzed with stories of triangular-shaped objects like those seen in the Dutch East Indies. Although many officials scoffed at the stories, more than one astronomer stuck to his belief that the mysterious things might be coming from outer space. Some planes and dirigibles were then unknown. There was no one on Earth who could have been responsible for them. In 1897, sightings in the United States began to be more frequent. One of the strangest reports describes an incident that began on April 9th. Flying at a great height, a huge cigar-shaped device was seen in the Midwest. Short wings projected from the sides of the object, according to reports of astronomers who watched it through telescopes. For almost a week, the aerial visitor was sighted around the Midwest, as far south as St. Louis and as far west as Colorado. Several times, red, green, and white lights were seen to flash in the sky. Some witnesses thought the crew of the strange craft might be trying to signal the Earth. On April 16th, the thing, whatever it was, disappeared from the Midwest. But on April 19th, the same object, or else a similar one, appeared over West Virginia. Early that morning, the town of Sisterville was awakened by blasts of the sawmill whistle. Those who went outside their homes saw a strange sight. From a torpedo-shaped object overhead, dazzling searchlights were pointing downward, sweeping the countryside. The thing appeared to be about 200 feet long, some 30 feet in diameter, with stubby wings and red and green lights along the sides. For almost 10 minutes, the aerial visitor circled the town. Then it swung eastward and vanished. The next report was published in the U.S. Weather Bureau's monthly weather review. On page 115 in the March 1904 issue, there is an account of an odd sighting at sea. On February 24th of 1904, a mysterious light had been seen above the Atlantic by crew members of the USS Supply. It was moving swiftly and evidently at high altitude. The report was attested by Lieutenant Frank H. Schofield, USN. On July 2nd of 1907, a mysterious explosion occurred in the heavens near Burlington, Vermont. Some witnesses described a strange torpedo-shaped device circling above. Shortly after it was seen, a round luminous object flashed down from the sky, then exploded. Another cigar-shaped craft was reported at a low altitude over Bridgewater, Massachusetts in 1905. Like the one at Sisterville, it carried searchlights, which swept back and forth across the countryside. After a few moments, the visitor rose in a steep climb, and the searchlights blinked out. There was no report for 1909 in America, though an odd aerial object was sighted near the Galapagos Islands. But in 1910, one January morning, a large silvery cigar-shaped device startled Chattanooga. After about 5 minutes, the thing sped away, appearing over Huntsville, Alabama, shortly afterward. It made a second appearance over Chattanooga the next day, then headed east and was never seen again. In Popular Astronomy, January 27, 1912, a Dr. F.B. Harris describes an intensely black object that he saw crossing the moon. As nearly as he could tell, it was gigantic in size, though again there was no way to be sure of its distance from him or the moon. With careful understatement, Dr. Harris said, "I think a very interesting and curious phenomenon happened that night. A strange shadow was noted on the clouds at Fort Worth, Texas, on April 8, 1913. It appeared to be caused by some large body hovering motionless above the clouds. As the cloud layer moved, the shadow remained in the same position. Then it changed size, diminishing, and quickly disappeared as if it had risen vertically." A report on this was given in the Weather Bureau Review of that year. By 1919, dirigibles were of course well known to most of the world. When a dirigible-shaped object appeared over Huntington, West Virginia in July of that year, there was no great alarm. It was believed to be an American blimp through the darkness. It was 11 at night, prevented observers from being sure. But a later checkup proved it was not an American ship, nor was it from any country possessing such craft. For some time after this, there were few authentic reports. Then in 1934, Nicholas Roerich, head of the American Roerich expedition into Tibet, had a remarkable experience that bears on the saucer riddle. On pages 361 and 362 of his book, Altai Himalaya, Roerich describes the incident. The expedition party was in the wilds of Tibet one morning when the porter noticed the peculiar actions of a buzzard overhead. He called Roerich's attention to it. Then they all saw something high in the sky, moving at great speed from north to south. Watching it through binoculars, Roerich saw it was an oval-shaped, obviously of huge size, and reflecting the sun's rays like brightly polished metal. When he trailed it with his glasses, the object suddenly changed direction from south to southwest. It was gone in a few moments. This was the last sighting listed before World War II. When I had finished, I stared out the plane window, curiously disturbed. Like most people, I had grown up believing the Earth was the center of everything: life, intelligence, and religion. Now, for the first time in my life, that belief was shaken. It was a curious thing. I could accept the idea that we would eventually explore space, land on the moon, and go on to distant planets. I had read of the plans, and I knew our engineers and scientists would somehow find a way. It did not disturb my belief in our superiority. But faced with this evidence of a superior race in the universe, my mind rebelled. For years I had been accustomed to thinking in comic strip terms of any possible spacemen. Buck Rogers stuff, with weird-looking spaceships and green-faced Martians. But now, if these sightings were true, the shoe was on the other foot. We would be faced with a race of beings at least 200 years ahead of our civilization, perhaps thousands. In their eyes, we might look like primitives. My conjectures before the takeoff had just been idle thinking. I had not really believed this could be the answer. But now the question came back sharply. How would we react to a sudden appearance of spaceships, bringing that higher race to the Earth? If we were fully prepared, educated to this tremendous adventure, it might come off without trouble. Unprepared, and we would be thrown into a panic. The lights of Philadelphia showed up ahead, and a thought struck me. What would Philadelphians of 1776 have thought to see this DC-6 flying across their city at 300 miles an hour? What would the sentries at Valley Forge have done, a year later, if this lighted airliner had streaked over their heads? Madness, stampede. Those were the plain answers. But there was a difference now. We have had modern miracles, radio, television, supersonic planes, and the promise of still more miracles. We could be educated, or at least partially prepared, to accept space visitors. In 50 years we had learned to fly. In 50 years more we would be exploring space. Why should we believe such creative intelligence was limited to the Earth? It would be incredible if the Earth, out of all the millions of planets, proved the only inhabited spot in the whole universe. But instinctively, I still fought against believing that the flying saucers were spaceships. Eventually, we would make contact with races on other planets. They undoubtedly would someday visit the Earth. But if it could be put off, a problem for later generations to handle. If the discs proved American-guided missiles, it would be an easier answer. Looking through the Project Saucer report Dewberry had loaned me, I read the space travel items, hoping to find some hint that this was a smokescreen. On page 18, in a discussion with Mars, I found this comment. Reports of strange objects seen in the skies have now been handed down through the generations. However, scientists believe that if Martians were now visiting the Earth without establishing contact, it would be assumed that they have just recently succeeded in space travel, that their civilization would be practically abreast of ours. This because they find it hard to believe that any technically established race would come here, flaunt its ability in mysterious ways over the years, but each time simply go away without ever establishing contact. There could be several answers to that. The Martians might not be able to live in our atmosphere, except in their sealed spaceships. They, or some other planet race, could have observed us periodically to check on our slow progress. Until we began to approach their level of civilization, or in some way cause them concern, they would probably see no reason for trying to make contact. But somehow I found a vague comfort in the argument, full of holes though it was. Searching further, I found other space travel comments. On one page, the Air Force admitted it was almost a certainty the space travelers would be operating from planets outside the solar system. But on the following page, I discovered this sentence. Thus, although visits from outer space are believed to be possible, they are thought to be highly improbable. What was the answer? Was this just a wandering discussion of possibilities, badly put together, or was it a hint of truth? It could be the first step in preparing America for a revelation. It could also be a carefully thought-out trick. This whole report might be designed to conceal a secret weapon. If the Air Force and the Navy did have a secret missile, what better way to distract attention? The old sighting reports could have been seized on as a build-up for space travel hints. Then it suddenly hit me. Even if it were a smokescreen, what of those old reports? They still remained to be answered. There was only one possible explanation, unless you discarded the sightings as lies. That meant discrediting many reliable witnesses. Naval officers, merchants, shipmasters, explorers, astronomers, ministers, and responsible public officials. Besides all these, there had been thousands of other witnesses, where large groups have seen the objects. The answer seemed inevitable, but I held it off. I didn't want to believe it, with all the changes it might bring, the unpredictable effect upon our civilization. If I kept on checking, I might find evidence that would bring a different explanation for the present saucers. Dewberry had put another group of reports in the envelope. This series covered the World War II phase and on up to the outbreak of the saucer scare in the United States. Some about the Foo Fighters, I already knew. This was tied in with the mystery rockets reported over Sweden. The first Swedish sightings had occurred during the early part of the war. Most of the so-called ghost rockets were seen at night, moving at tremendous speed. Since they came from the direction of Germany, most Swedes believed that guided rockets were the answer. During the summer of 1946, after the Russians had taken over Pamanud, the Nazi missile test base, ghost rockets again were reported flying over Sweden. Some were said to double back and fly into Soviet areas. Practically all were seen at night, and therefore none had been described as a flying disc. Instead, they were said to be colored lights, red, green, blue, and orange, often blurred from their high speed. But there was a puzzling complication. Mystery lights and sometimes flying discs were simultaneously reported over Greece, Portugal, Turkey, Spain, and even French Morocco. Either there were two answers, or some nation had developed missiles with an incredibly long range. By January of 1947, ghost rocket sightings in Europe had diminished to less than one a month. Oddly enough, the first disc reported admitted by Project Saucer was in this same month. The first 47 case detailed by Project Saucer occurred at Richmond, Virginia. It was about the middle of April. A Richmond weather observer had released a balloon and was tracking it with a theodolite when a strange object crossed his field of vision. He swung the theodolite and managed to track the thing despite its high speed. The actual speed and altitude, the latter determined by a comparison of the balloon's height at various times, has never been released. Nor has the Air Force released its observer's report of the object's size, which Project Saucer admitted was more accurate than most witnesses' estimates. About the 17th of May of 1947, a huge oval-shaped saucer 10 times longer than its diameter was sighted by Byron Savage, an Oklahoma City pilot. 2 days later, another fast-flying saucer was reported in Mountain Springs, Colorado. In the short time it was observed, it was seen to change direction twice, maneuvering at an unbelievable speed. Then on June 24th came Kenneth Arnold's famous report, which set off the saucer scare. The rest of the story I now knew almost by heart. When the DC-6 landed at Washington, I had made one decision. Since it was impossible to check up on most of the old sightings, I would concentrate on certain recent reports, cases in which the objects have been described as spaceships. As I waited for a taxi, I looked up at the sky. It was a clear summer night without a single cloud. Beyond the low hill to the west, I could see the stars. I can still remember thinking, if it's true, then the stars will never again seem the same. Chapter 8. The next morning, in the broad light of day, the idea of space visitors somehow had lost its menace. If the discs were spaceships, at least they had shown no sign of hostility so far as I knew. Of course there was Mantell, but if he had been downed by some weapon of the disc, it could have been self-defense. In most cases, the saucers retreated at the first sign of pursuit. My mind was still reluctant to accept the space travel answer, in spite of the old reports. But I kept thinking of the famous aircraft designer who thought the discs were spacecrafts, the airline pilots Purdy had mentioned. Blake's co-pilot, Chuck. Now that I recalled it, Blake had seemed more embarrassed than seemed called for when he told about Chuck. Perhaps he had been the one who believed the saucers were spaceships instead of his absent co-pilot. At breakfast, I went over the list of sightings since June of 1947. There were several saucers that actually had been described as projectile-like ships. The most famous of all was the Eastern Airlines case. It was 8:30 p.m., July 23rd of 1948, when an Eastern Airlines DC-3 took off from Houston, Texas, on a flight to Atlanta from Boston. The airline captain was Clarence S. Chiles. During the war, he had been in the Air Transport Command with the rank Lieutenant Colonel. He had 8,500 flying hours. His first officer was John B. Whitted, a wartime pilot on B-29s. Both men were known in Eastern as careful, conservative pilots. It was a bright, moonlit night with scattered clouds overhead. The DC-3 was 20 miles west of Montgomery at 2:45 a.m., when a brilliant projectile-life craft came hurtling along the airway. Chiles saw it first and took it to be a jet plane. But the next instant, both pilots saw that this was no jet fighter. "It was heading southwest," Chiles said later, "exactly opposite to our course. Whatever it was, it flashed down toward us at terrific speed. We veered to the left. It veered sharply too and passed us about 700 feet to the right. I saw then that it had no wings." The mystery ship passed on Whitted's side, and he had a fairly close look. "The thing was about 100 feet long, cigar-shaped, and wingless," he described it. "It was about twice the diameter of a B-29 with no protruding fins. Captain Chiles said the cabin appeared like a pilot compartment, except for its eerie brilliance. Both he and Whitted agreed it was as bright as a magnesium flare. They saw no occupants, but at their speed this was not surprising. An intense dark blue glow came from the side of the ship," Chiles reported. It was later suggested by engineers that the strange glare could have come from a power plant of unusual type. It ran the entire length of the fuselage, like a blue fluorescent light. The exhaust was a red-orange flame with a lighter color predominant around the outer edges. Both pilots said the flame extended 30 to 50 feet behind the ship. As it passed, Chiles noted a snout like a radar pole. Both he and Whitted glimpsed 2 rows of windows. "Just as it went by," said Chiles. The pilot pulled up as if he had seen the DC-3 and wanted to avoid it. There was a tremendous burst of flame from the rear. It zoomed into the clouds, its jet wash rocking our DC-3. Chiles' estimate of the mystery ship's speed was between 500 and 700 miles an hour. As the object vanished, Chiles went back into the cabin to check with the passengers. Most had been asleep or were drowsing, but one man confirmed that they were in their right senses. This passenger, Clarence McKelvey of Columbus, Ohio, told them, and a Project Saucer team later, that he had seen a brilliant streak of light flash past his window. It had gone too swiftly for him to catch any details. The AP interviewed Mr. McKelvey soon after he landed and ran the following story. Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, July 24th. Associated Press. Clarence L. McKelvey, assisting managing editor of the American Education Press, said he was the only passenger on the EAL Houston-Boston plane who was not asleep when the phantom craft was sighted. I saw no shape or form, Mr. McKelvey said. I was on the right side of the plane, and suddenly I saw this strange eerie streak out of my window. It was very intense, not like lightning or anything I had ever seen. The Columbus man said he was too startled and the object moved too quickly for him to adjust his eyes to it. In Washington, Air Force officials insisted they could shed no light on the mystery. Out in Santa Monica, General George C. Kenney, then chief of the Strategic Air Command, declared that the Air Force had nothing remotely like the ship described. I wish we did, General Kenney told reporters. I'd sure like to see that. The publicized story of this spaceship set off another scare. Also the usual cracks about screwball pilots. But Chiles and Whitted were not screwballs. They were highly respected pilots. The passenger's confirmation added weight. But even if all three had been considered deluded, the Air Force investigators could not get around the reports from Robbins Air Force Base. Just about 1 hour before the DC-3 incident, a strange flaming object came racing southward through the night skies over Robbins Field, at Macon, Georgia. Observers at the airbase were astounded to see what appeared to be a huge, wingless craft streak overhead, trailing a varicolored exhaust. The witnesses' description tallied with those of Chiles and Whitted. The mystery ship vanished swiftly. All observers agreed that it disappeared from the line of sight, just like a normal aircraft. When I was working on this case, a contact in Washington gave me an interesting tip. Within 48 hours after that Eastern sighting, Air Force engineers rushed out blueprint plans and elevations of the spaceship, based on what two pilots told them. Whether or not this was true, I found that the Air Force engineers did compute the probable speed and lift of the mystery craft. The ship was found to be within the bounds of aerodynamic laws for operations in our atmosphere. Here is the Air Force statement. Application of the Prandtl theory of lift indicated that a fuselage of the dimensions reported by Chiles and Whitted could support a load comparable to the weight of an aircraft of this size, at flying speeds in the subsonic range. This supports Chiles' estimate of 500 to 700 miles per hour. 4 days after the spaceship story was published, a Navy spokesman was quoted as hinting it might have been a high-atmosphere rocket, gone astray from the proving grounds in New Mexico. The brief report appeared on the editorial page of the Washington Star on July 28th of 1947. It ran as follows. The Navy says that naval technicians have been testing a 3,000-mile-per-hour rocket in New Mexico. If one went astray, it could travel across our continent in a short time. At first glance, I thought this might be the real answer to the Chiles-Whitted case. But after a few minutes, I saw that it was almost impossible. First, rockets at White Sands are launched and controlled with utmost care. There had been no reported cases of such a long-distance runaway. Second, if such a rocket had gone astray, it would certainly have caused wild confusion at White Sands until they found where it landed. Hundreds of people would have known about it. The story would be certain to leak out. Third, such a rocket would have to have traveled from White Sands to Macon, Georgia, then circle around south of this city for over 40 minutes. If it had kept at the speed observed at Robbins Field, it would have passed Montgomery long before the DC-3 reached the area. In addition, the rockets would have had to veer sharply away from the airliner, as both pilots testified, and then zoom into the clouds. No high-atmosphere test rocket had automatic control such as this would require. And if it had gone astray from White Sands, the station's remote control would no longer be guiding it. The Eastern Airlines spaceship, then, was not just a fugitive rocket, but it could be a new type of aircraft, something revolutionary, developed in absolute secrecy. Other airline pilots reported flying discs racing along the airways, though none that I knew of had described projectile-like objects. Chiles and Whitted insisted that mystery ship was not a disc, and the report from Robbins Field agreed on this point. Man-made devices or not, it seemed fairly certain there was more than one type of saucer. The more I studied the evidence, the harder it was to believe that this was an Earth-made ship. Such a wingless rocket ship would require tremendous jet power to keep it in the air. Even our latest jet bombers cannot begin to approach its performance. Going back over the Project Saucer preliminary report, I found strong evidence that the Air Force was worried. In their investigation, project teams have screened 225 military and civilian flight schedules. After 9 months, They reported that the mysterious object was no conventional aircraft. On April 27th of 1949, the Air Force admitted that Project Saucer had failed to find the answer. The spaceship was officially listed as unidentified. But Wright Field is still working on it, an Air Force officer told me. Both Chiles and Whitted are responsible pilots, and McKelvey had a reputation of making careful statements. Even without the Robbins Field confirmation, no one could doubt that they saw something. The Chiles-Whitted spaceship was not the first of this type to be reported. Another wingless aircraft was sighted in August of 1947 by two pilots for an Alabama flying service. It was at Bethel, Alabama, just after sunset, when a huge black wingless craft swept over their course. Silhouetted against the evening sky, it looked larger than a C-54. The pilots saw no wings, motors, or jet exhausts. Swinging in behind the mystery ship, they attempted to follow. But at their speed of 170 miles per hour, they were quickly outdistanced. Careful checking showed there were no other planes nearby that could have been mistaken for this strange craft. On New Year's Day in 1948, a similar rocket-shaped object was sighted at Jackson, Mississippi. It was first seen by a former Air Force pilot and his passenger, and later by witnesses on the ground. Before the pilot could begin to close in, the odd wingless ship pulled away, speeding up from 200 to 500 miles per hour. It swiftly disappeared. Besides these two cases, already on record, I had the tips Purdy had given me. One wingless ship was supposed to have been seen 3 or 4 days before the Chiles-Whitted sighting. Like the thing they reported, the unidentified craft was a double-deck spaceship and moving at even higher speed. At first I ran into a stone wall trying to check this story. Then I found a lead confirming that this is a foreign report. It finally proved to be from The Hague. The tip had been right. This double-decked wingless ship had been sighted on July 20th of 1948, 4 days before the Eastern case. Witnesses have reported it at high altitude, moving at fantastic speed. While working on this report, I verified another tip. We had heard a rumor of a spaceship sighting at Clark Field in the Philippine Islands. Although I didn't learn the date, I found that there was such a record. In the final Project Saucer report, the attempt to explain away this sighting was painfully evident. Analyzing this case, number 206, the Air Force said, "If the facts are correct, there is no astronomical explanation. A few points favor the daytime meteor hypothesis. Snow-white color, speed faster than a jet, the roar, similarity to skywriting in the time of day. But the tactics, if really performed, oppose it strenuously. The maneuvers in and out of cloud banks, turns of 180 degrees or more. Possibly these were illusions caused by seeing the object intermittently through clouds. The impression of a fuselage with windows could even more easily have been a sign of imagination." In following up with the Jackson and Bethel reports, I talked with two officials in the Civil Aeronautics Administration. One of these was Charlie Plank, who handled public relations. I found that the pilots concerned had good records. CAA men who knew them discounted the hoax theory. "Charlie, there's a rumor that airline pilots have been ordered not to talk," I told Plank. "You know anything about it?" "You mean ordered by the Air Force or the companies?" He said, "The Air Force and the CAA. If the CAA's in on it, it's a top-level deal," said Charlie. "I think it's more likely the companies, with or without a nudge from the Air Force." While we were talking, an official from another agency came in. Because the lead he gave me was off the record, I'll call him Steve Barrett. I knew Steve fairly well. We were both pilots with service training. Our paths have crossed during the war. I saw him now and then at airports around Washington. When the saucer scare first broke, Steve had been disgusted. "Damn fools trying to get publicity," he snorted. "The way Americans fall for a gag. Even the Air Force has got the jitters." So I was a little surprised to find he now thought the discs were real. "What sold you?" I asked. The radar reports," said Steve. "I know of half a dozen cases where they tracked the things. One was in Japan. The thing was climbing up so fast no one believed the radar men at first. Then they got some more reports. One was up in Canada. There was a case in New Mexico. I think a Navy destroyer tracked a saucer up in the North Atlantic." "What did they find out?" said Charlie Plank. Steve shrugged. "I don't know all the answers. Whatever they are, the thing can go like hell." I had a hunch he was holding back. I waited until he had finished with Charlie and then went down the hall with him. "You think the saucers are guided missiles?" I said. "If I thought so, I wouldn't be talking," he said flatly.
That's not a dig at you, but I was cleared last year for some secret electronics work. It might be used in some way with guided missiles.
I didn't know that, Steve.
Nah, it's okay, he said. I don't mind talking, because we can't believe the saucers are guided missiles. Maybe a few of the things sighted out in the southwest of BR test rockets. And that doesn't explain the radar reports in Canada and Japan.
I've already heard about a radar case in Labrador, I told Steve.
He looked at me quickly. Where'd you pick that up?
True passed it on to me, I said.
They've had some trouble tracking things that maneuver so fast, said Steve. It sounds crazy, but I've been told they'd hit more than 10,000 miles an hour.
You believe it?
Well, it's not impossible. These saucers are tracked up to 50 miles up where there's not much resistance.
The elevator door opened. Steve waited until we were outside of the Commerce building.
There's one other thing that gets me, he said. Unless the radar boys are way off, some of these saucers are enormous. I just can't see a guided missile 500 feet in diameter.
He stopped for a moment.
I suppose this will sound screwy to you.
You think they're interplanetary, I said. Steve was quickly on the defensive.
I hadn't bought it yet, but it's not as crazy as it sounds.
Without mentioning names, I told him the aircraft designer and the airline pilots.
They're in good company, said Steve. You know the Air Institute?
Sure, the Air Force School down in Montgomery.
6 months ago, I was talking with an officer who'd been instructing there.
Steve looked at me deadly serious.
He told me they're now teaching that the saucers are probably spaceships.
Chapter 9. 3 days after my meeting with Steve Barrett, I was on a mainliner 300 starting a new phase of the saucer investigation. By the time I returned, I hoped to know the truth about Project Saucer. As the ship droned westward, 14,000 feet above the Alahines, I thought of what Steve had told me. I believed that he had told me about the radar tracking, and I was fairly sure he believed the Air Institute story. But I wasn't so certain the story itself was true. It would hardly be a gag. Steve wasn't easily taken in. It was more likely that one Institute officer, or perhaps several, believed the saucers were spacecraft and aired their personal opinions. The Institute wasn't likely to give an official answer to something that Project Saucer still declared unsolved. If it were possible to get an inside look at Project Saucer operations, I could soon tell whether it was an actual investigation or a deliberate cover-up for something else. Whichever it was, the wall of official secrecy still hid it. As a formality, I had called the Pentagon again and asked to talk with some of the project officers. As I expected, I was turned down. The only alternative was to dig out the story by talking with pilots and others who had been quizzed by project teams. I had several leads, and True had arranged some interviews for me. My first stop was Chicago, where I met an airline official and 2 commercial pilots. I saw the pilots first, since they both talked in confidence. I will not use their right names. One, a Midwesterner I already knew, I'll call Pete Farrell. The other, a wartime instructor, Art Green. Pete was about 31, stocky, blue-eyed, with a pleasant, intelligent face. Art Green was a little older, a lean, sunburned, restless man with an emphatic voice. Pete had served with the Air Force during the war. He was now part owner of a flying school. Also a pilot in the Air National Guard. Green was working for an air charter service. We met at the Palmer House. Art Green didn't need much prompting to talk about Project Saucer. After reporting a disc seen during a West Coast right, he had been thoroughly grilled by Project Saucer team.
They practically took me apart, he said irritably. They got a lot of trick questions. Some of them are figured out to trip up anybody faking a story. The way they worked on me, you'd think I committed a murder. Then they'd sell me on the idea I'd seen a balloon or maybe a plane, with the sun shining on it when it blinked. I told them to go to the devil. I knew what I saw. Now, after 17 years, I've got enough sense to tell a ship or a balloon when I see it.
Did you believe them? I asked him.
If they did, they didn't let on. 2 of them acted as if I was nuts. The other guy, I think he was Air Force Intelligence, he acted decent. He said not to get steamed up about the aeromedical boys. It was their job to screen out the crackpots. And on top of that, I found out later the FBI had checked up on me to find out if I was a liar or a screwball. They went around to my boss, people in my neighborhood, even the pilots in my outfit. My outfit's still razzing me. I wouldn't report another saucer if one flew through my cockpit.
Pete Farrell hadn't encountered any Project Saucer teams personally, but he had some interesting angles. Some of the information had come from commercial and private pilots in the Midwest, part of it through National Guard contacts. "I sure can tell you one thing," Pete said. "Guard pilots got the same order as the Air Force. If we saw anything peculiar flying around, we would do our damnedest to identify it. What about trying to bring one down? I've heard that was in one order." Pete hesitated for a second. "Look, I've told you that much because it's been in the papers, but I'm still in the Guard. I can't tell you the order itself. It was confidential." "Well, I'm not in the Guard," said Art Green. He lit a cigarette and blew out the match. "Why don't you look into the Gorman case? Get the dope on that court-martial angle." I'd heard of the Gorman case, but the court-martial thing was new to me. Gorman, I recalled, was a fighter pilot in North Dakota Air National Guard. He had a mystifying encounter with a strange, fast-moving light over Farragut Airport in the fall of 1948. "That case is on my list," I told Green, "but I don't remember anything about a court-martial." "It wasn't in the papers, but all the pilots up that way know about it. In his report, Gorman said something about trying to ram the thing. The idea got around that Air Force orders had said to try this. Anyway, it got into the papers and Gordon almost got court-martialed. If his family hadn't had some influence in the state, the Air Force probably would have pushed it." "Are you sure about this?" I said. "You know how those things build up." "Ask Gorman," he said, "or ask some of the pilots at Fargo." Before I left them, Green double-checked my report on his sighting, which Hilton had forwarded. As in the majority of cases, he had just seen one disk. It had hovered at a very high altitude, gleaming in the sun, then it suddenly accelerated and raced off to the north. "I couldn't tell you its size or speed," said Green, "but if it was as high as I think, it must have been pretty big." Pete told me later that Green believed the disk had been at least 20 miles high, because it was well above clouds at 30,000 feet. "It's kind of hard to believe," said Pete. "The thing would have to be a lot bigger than a B-29, and the speed over 2,000 miles an hour. You know what they say about the Mantell saucer?" I reminded him. "Some of the Godman Field people said it was at least 300 feet in diameter." "And I heard it was twice as that," said Pete. "You know any Kentucky National Guard pilots?" I asked. "One or two," said Pete, "but they couldn't tell me anything. It was hushed up too fast." That evening I talked with the airline official, whom I knew well enough to call by his first name. I put it to him bluntly. "Dick, if you're under orders not to talk, just tell me. I'm trying to find out whether Project Saucer has muzzled airline pilots. You mean the ones who saw the things. Perhaps in a few cases. Most of the pilots know what happened to Captain Emil Smith on United and those Houston pilots. They keep still so they won't be laughed at. Also, the airlines don't like their pilots to talk for publication." "I've heard of several cases," I said, "where Air Force intelligence is supposed to have warned pilots to keep mum. Two of the reports come pretty straight." He made a gesture. "That could be. I'm not denying that airline pilots, and that includes ours, see these things all the time. They've been sighted on the Seattle-Alaska route, and between Anchorage and Japan. I know of several saucers that pilots have seen between Honolulu and the mainland. Check with Pan American, you'll find their pilots have seen them too." "What happened to those reports?" "They go to operations," said Dick. "Of course, if something really important happens, the pilot may radio the tower before he lands. Then the CAA gets word to the Air Force, and they rush some intelligence officers to quiz the pilots. If it's not too hot, they come from right field, regular Project Saucer teams. Otherwise, they send the nearest intelligence officers to take over temporarily." I asked him if he had ever been on one of these sessions. Dick said he hadn't. But a couple of pilots talked to me later. And they said these Air Force men seemed quite upset about it. They pounced on everything these boys said about the thing's appearance, how it maneuvered, and so on. "What did your pilots think the saucers are?" Dick gave me a slightly ironic grin. "Why ask me? Captain Blake says you've been getting it firsthand." "I wasn't pulling a fast one," I protested. "We're not going to quote actual names or sources unless people are okay with it." "Sure, I know that," said Dick. "But you've got the answer already. Some pilots say interplanetary, some say guided missiles. A few, a very few, still think it's all nonsense because they hadn't seen any." "What do you think?" "I don't know the secret," said Dick. "But I'm positive of one thing. Either the Air Force is sitting on a big secret or they're badly scared because they don't know the answer." During the next week or so, I covered several northwest and mountain states. Although I was chiefly trying to find out about Project Saucer, I ran into 2 sightings that were not on my list. One of these had occurred in California, at Fairfield Suisun Air Force Base. A Seattle man who had been stationed there gave me the details. It was on the night of December 1918, with unusually high winds sweeping across the airfield. At times, the gusts reached almost 70 miles an hour. Suddenly, a weird ball of light flashed into view at a height of 1,000 feet. As the men on the base watched it, astonished, the mystery light abruptly shot skyward. In an incredibly short time, it reached an altitude of 20,000 feet and vanished. Was there any shape outlined behind the light? I asked the Seattle man. Nobody saw any, he replied. It looked just like I said, a ball of light going like a streak. Did it leave any smoke behind it? You mean like an engine or a jet? He shook his head. Not a thing. And it didn't make a sound, even when it shot up like that. Did you hear any guesses about it or reports later on? Some major who didn't see it said it must have been a balloon. Anyone with brains could see that was screwy. No balloon ever went up that fast. And besides, the thing was going against the wind. The second incident occurred at Salmon Dam, Idaho, on August 13th, 1947. When I heard the date, it sounded familiar. I checked my sightings files and saw it was the same day as a strange affair at Twin Falls, Idaho. In the Twin Falls case, the disc was sighted by observers in a canyon. There was one interesting difference from the usual description. This disc was sky blue, or else its gleaming surface somehow reflected the sky, because of the angle of vision. Although it was not close to the treetops, the observers were amazed to see the trees whip violently when the disc raced overhead, as though the air was boiling from the object's swift passage. At Salmon Dam, that same day, 2 miners heard an odd roaring sound and stared into the sky. Several miles away, 2 brightly gleaming discs were circling at high speed. It was like 2 round mirrors whirling around the sky, one of the men was later quoted as saying. They couldn't have been any ordinary planes, not round like that, and they were going too fast. During this part of the trip, I also was told that one saucer had fallen into a mountain lake. This came to me secondhand. The lone witness was said to have rushed over to his car to get his camera as the disc approached. When it plunged toward the lake, he was so startled that he failed to snap the picture until the moment it struck. This story sounded so flimsy that I didn't bother to list it. Months later, a Washington newsman confirmed at least part of the lake story. When he first related it, I thought he had fallen for a gag. I heard that yarn, I said. Don't tell me you believe it. I came from Idaho, he told me, and I happen to know the fellow who took that picture. Maybe it wasn't a disc, but something fell into that lake. Did you see the picture? Yes, at the Pentagon. At my surprised look, he added, That was long before they clamped down. I was talking to an Air Force officer about this lake thing, and he showed me the picture. What did it look like? He couldn't tell much about it, just a big splash and a blur where something went under. Maybe a magnifying glass would bring it out, but I didn't get a chance to try it. It was early in 1950 when he told me this. I asked at the Pentagon if this picture was in the right field files, and if so, whether I could see it. My inquiries drew blank looks. No one remembered such a photograph, and even if it were in the Project Saucer files, I couldn't see it. This was more than 2 months after Project Saucer had been officially closed, and its secrets presumably all revealed. The rest of my interviews during this 1949 trip helped to round out my picture of Project Saucer operations. Some witnesses seemed afraid to talk. A few flatly refused. I found no proof of official pressure, but I frequently had the feeling that strong hints had been dropped. Though 1 or 2 witnesses showed resentment at investigators' methods, most of them seemed more annoyed at the loss of time involved. One man had been checked first by the police, then by the sheriff's office. An Air Force team spent hours questioning him, returning the next day, and finally the FBI had made a character check. What he told me about the Air Force interrogation confirmed one of Art Green's statements. One intelligence captain tried to tell me I'd seen a weather balloon. I called up the airport and had them check on release schedules. They said next day it didn't fit any schedules around this area. Anyway, the wind wasn't right because the thing I saw was cutting into the wind at 45-degree angle. Other witnesses told me that investigators had suggested birds, meteors, reflections on clouds, shooting stars, and star shells as probable explanations of what they had been. I learned of one pilot who had been startled by seeing a group of discs racing past his plane. Air Force investigators later suggested that he had flown through a flock of birds, or perhaps a cluster of balloons. On the flight back to Washington, I reread all the information the Air Force had released on Project Saucer. Suddenly a familiar phrase caught my eye. I read over the paragraph again. Preliminary study of more than 240 domestic and 30 foreign incidents by astrophysicist Hynek indicates an overall total of about 30% can probably be explained away as astronomical phenomena. Explained away. I went through the report line by line. On page 17, I found this. Available preliminary reports now indicate that a great number of sightings can be explained away as ordinary occurrences which have been misinterpreted as a result of human errors. On page 22, I ran onto another use of the phrase. The obvious explanation for most of the spherical-shaped objects reported, as already mentioned, is that they are meteorological or similarly typed balloons. This, however, does not explain reports that they travel at high speed or maneuver rapidly. But saucer men point out that the movement could be explained away as an optical illusion, or rather acceleration of the balloon, caused by a gas leak and later exaggerated by observers. There are scores of possible explanations for the scores of different type sightings reported. Explained away. It might not mean anything. It could just be an unfortunate choice of words. But suppose that the real reason to Project Saucer was to cover up something, or that its purpose was to investigate something serious, at the same time covering it up step by step. The Project Saucer teams then would check on reports and simultaneously try to divert attention from the truth, suggesting various answers to explain the sightings. Back at Wright Field, analysts and intelligence officers would go over the general picture and try to work up plausible explanations, which, if necessary, could even be published. Explaining away would be one of the main purposes of project personnel. These words would probably be used in discussions of ways of means. They would undoubtedly be used in secret official papers. And since this published preliminary report had been made up from censored secret files, the use of these familiar words might have been overlooked since, read casually, they would appear harmless. If the report had been thrown together hastily, the use of these telltale words could be easily understood, and so the report's strange contradictions. As an experiment, I fixed the idea firmly in mind that Project Saucer was a cover-up unit. Then I went back once more and read the items quoted above. The effect was almost startling. It was as though I was reading confidential suggestions for diverting attention and explaining away the sightings. Suggestions made by project members and probably circulated for comment. Wait a minute, I said to myself. You may be dreaming up this whole thing. Trying to get back to a neutral viewpoint, I skimmed through the other details of project operations, as described in the report. The order creating Project Saucer was signed on December 30th of 1947. On January 22nd of 1948, 2 weeks after Captain Mantell's death, the project officially began operations. Preliminary investigation at Godman Field had been done by local intelligence officers. Project Saucer was set up under the Air Material Command at Wright Field. Contracts were made with an astrophysicist, Professor Joseph Hynek, after a prominent scientist and a group of evaluation experts, Rand Corporation. Arrangements were made for services by the Air Weather Service, Andrews Field, the U.S. Weather Bureau, their Electronics Laboratory, Cambridge Field Station, the AMC Aero Medical Laboratory, the Army and Navy Departments, the FBI, the Department of Commerce, Civil Aeronautics Administration, and various other government and private agencies. In addition, the services of rocket experts, guided missile authorities, space travel planners, and others were made available as desired. Under the heading How Incidents Are Investigated, the Project Saucer report says, but the hoaxes and crank letters in reality play a small part in Project Saucer. Actually, it is a serious scientific business of constant investigation, analysis, and evaluation, which thus far has yielded evidence pointing to the conclusion that much of the saucer scare is not scare at all, but can be attributed to astronomical phenomena, to conventional aerial objects, to hallucinations, and to mass psychology. But the mere existence of some yet unidentified flying objects necessitates a constant vigilance on the part of Project Saucer personnel and the civilian population. Investigation is greatly stepped up when observers report incidents as soon as possible, to the nearest military installation or to headquarters AMC direct. A standard questionnaire is filled out under the guidance of interrogators. In each case, time, location, size, and shape of object, approximate altitude, speed, maneuvers, color, length of time in sight, sound, etc. are carefully noted. This information is sent in its entirety, together with any fragments, soil photographs, drawings, etc., to Headquarters AMC. Here, highly trained evaluation teams take over. The information is broken down and filed on summary sheets, plotted on maps and graphs, and integrated with the rest of the material, giving an easily comprehended overall picture. Duplicate copies of each incident arc are sent to other investigating agencies, including technical labs within the Air Material Command. These are studied in relation to many factors such as guided missile research activity, weather, and many other atmospheric sounding balloon launchings, commercial and military aircraft flights, flights of migratory birds, and a myriad of other considerations, which might furnish explanations. Generally, the flying objects are divided into 4 groups: flying discs, torpedo or cigar-shaped bodies with no wings or fins visible in flight, spherical or balloon-shaped objects, and balls of light. The first 3 groups are capable of flight by aerodynamic or aerostatic means, and can be propelled and controlled by methods known to aeronautical engineers. As for the lights, their actions, unless they were suspended from a higher object or were the product of hallucination, remain unexplained. Eventually, reports are sent back to Project Saucer headquarters, often marking incidents closed. The project, however, is a young one. Much of its investigation is still underway. Currently, a psychological analysis is being made by AMC's Aeromedical Laboratory to determine what percentages of incidents are probably based on errors of the human mind and senses. Available preliminary reports now indicate that a great number can be explained away as ordinary occurrences, which have been misrepresented as a result of these human errors. Near the end of the last page, a paragraph sum tipped the report. The saucers are not a joke. Neither are they cause for alarm to the population. Many of the incidents already have answers: meteors, balloons, falling stars, birds in flight, testing devices, etc. Some of them still end in question marks. From what I had learned on this trip, I strongly doubted the answers suggested. All but the testing devices. What do they mean by that? It could be a hint at guided missiles. They had already mentioned guided missile research activity in another spot. But if that was what lay behind this elaborate project, they would hardly be hinting at it. If the answer was space travel, then such hints made sense. They would be part of the cover-up plan. Everyone, including the Soviet Union, knew we were working on guided missiles. It would do no harm to use this as one of the myriad explanations for the flying saucers. I was still trying to figure it out when my plane let down for the landing at Washington. I had hoped by this time to know the truth about Project Saucer. Instead, it was a deeper mystery than ever. True, I had found out how they operated, outside of Wright Field. Some of the incidents had been enlightening, but now I was certain that Project Saucer was trying hard to explain away the sightings, and hide the real answer.
Chapter 10. When I reached home, I found a brief letter from Ken Purdy. Dear Don, the Mantel and Eastern cases both look good. I don't see how they can brush them off. It looks more like the interplanetary answer to me, but we won't decide on treatment until we're sure. I had suggested 2 or 3 angles if this proved the real answer. Who would be the best authority to check our disk operation theory and give us more details on directional control? I'd like to have it checked by 2 more engineers. Ken. Next day, I dug out my copy of Bull's interview with D, the famous aircraft designer.
Certainly the flying saucers are possible, the designer had told Bull. Give me enough money and I'll build you one. It might have to be a model because the fuel would be a problem. If the saucers that have been seen came from other worlds, which isn't at all Buck Rogerish, they may be powered by atomic energy or by the energy that produces cosmic rays, which is many times more powerful, or by some other fuel or natural force that our research hasn't yet discovered, but the circular airfoil is quite feasible. It wouldn't have the stability of the conventional airplane, but it would have enormous maneuverability. It could rise vertically, hover, descend vertically, and fly at extremely high speed, with the proper power. Don't take my word for it, check with other engineers. Before looking up a private engineer I had in mind, I went to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The NACA is America's most authoritative source of aerodynamic knowledge. I knew they had already tried out disc-shaped airfoils, and I asked about this first. I found that 2 official NACA reports, Technical Note 539 and Report 431, discussed tests on circular and elliptical Clark-Y airfoils. Both reports state that these designs were found practical. Later, I talked with one of the top engineers in the NACA. Without showing him D's sketch, I asked how a disc might operate. "It could be built with variable direction jet or rocket nozzles," he said. "The nozzles will be placed around the rim, and by changing their direction, the disc could be made to rise and descend vertically. It could hover, fly straight ahead, and make sharp turns. Its direction and velocity would be governed by the number of nozzles operating, the power applied, and the angle at which they were tilted. They could be pointed towards the ground, rearward in a lateral direction, or in various combinations. A disc flying level, straight ahead, could be turned swiftly to right or left by shifting the angles of the nozzles, or cutting off power from part of the group. This method of control would operate in the Earth's atmosphere and also using rocket power in free space, where conventional controls would be useless. The method he had described was not the one which D had outlined. "What about a rotating disc?" I asked the NACA man. "Suppose you had one with a stationary center and a large circular section rotating around it. The rotating part would have a chamber built into it, or would have slotted vanes." He gave me a curious look. "Where'd you get that idea about the chamber?" I told him it had come to me from True. "It could be done," he said. "The slotted vanes method has already been tried. There's an engineer in Glendale, California who's built the model. His name's EWK. He gave me a few details on how a chambered or slotted vane rotating disc might operate, then interrupted himself to ask me what I thought the saucers were. "They're either interplanetary or some secret development," I said. "What do you think?" "The NACA has no proof they even exist," he answered. When I left the building a few minutes later, I was still weighing that statement. If the Air Force or the Navy had a secret disc device, the NACA would almost certainly know about it. The chances were that any disc-shaped missile or any new type of circular aircraft would first have been tested in the NACA wind tunnels at Langley Field. If the saucers were interplanetary, the NACA, at least top officials, would probably have been in any discussion on the disc's performance. Either way, the NACA's official attitude could be expected to match the Pentagon's. After lunch, I took a taxi to the office of the private engineer. Like D, he had asked that he not be quoted by name. The name I'm using, Paul Reddle, will serve that purpose. Reddle is a well-known aeronautical engineer. He's worked with major aircraft companies and served as a special consultant to government agencies and the industries. He is also a competent pilot. Although I had known him for several years, he refused at first to talk about the saucers. Then I realized he thought I meant to quote him. I showed him some of the material I had roughed out, in which names were omitted or changed as requested. "All right," Reddle said finally. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you can tell us. But first, your idea on these sketches." I showed him D's drawings and gave him the high points in the investigation. When I mentioned the mystery light incident at Fairfield Susan Air Force Base, Reddle sat up quickly. "The Goldman case again." "We heard about some other light cases," I said. "One was at Las Vegas." "I know about that one. That is, if you mean the green light. Wait a minute." Reddle frowned into space for a few seconds. "You say that Fairfield Susan sighting was on December 3rd. Then the Las Vegas sighting was only a few days later. It was the first week of the month, I'm positive." "These light reports have got me stumped," I said. "A light can't just fly around by itself. And these 2-foot discs. You haven't worked on the Goldman case?" asked Reddle. I told him I hadn't thought it was coming up on my schedule. "Leave these sketches here," he said. "Look into that Goldman sighting. Then check on our plans for space exploration. I'll give you some sources. When you get through, come on back and we'll talk it over." The Gorman saucer dogfight had been described in newspapers. The pilot had reported chasing a swiftly maneuvering white light, which had finally escaped him. Judging from the Project Saucer preliminary report, this case had baffled all the Air Force investigators. When I met George Gorman, I found him to be intelligent, cool-headed, and very firmly convinced of every detail in his story. I had learned something about his background. He had had college training during the war. He had been an Air Force instructor, training French student pilots. In Fargo, his home, he had a good reputation, not only for veracity but as a businessman. Only 26, he was part owner of a construction company, and also the Fargo representative for a hardware store chain. Even knowing all this, I found it hard at first to believe some of the dogfight details, but the ground observers confirmed them. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening on October 1st, 1948. Gorman, now an Air National Guard lieutenant, had been on a practice flight in an F-51 fighter. The other pilots on this practice patrol had already landed. Gorman had just been cleared by the CIA operator in the Fargo Airport Tower when he saw a fast-moving light below his circling fighter. From his altitude of 4,500 feet, it appeared to be the tail light of a swiftly flying plane. As nearly as he could tell, it was 1,000 feet high, moving at about 250 miles per hour. Gorman called the tower to recheck his clearance. He was told the only other plane in the area was a Piper Cub. Gorman could see the Cub plainly outlined below him. There was a night football game going on, and the field was brightly lighted. But the Cub was nowhere near the strange light. As the mystery light raced across the football field, Gordon noticed an odd phenomenon. Instead of seeing the silhouette of a plane, he saw no shape at all around the light. By contrast, he could see the Cub's outline clearly. Meanwhile, the airport traffic controller L.D. Jensen had also spotted the unusual light. Concerned with the danger of collision, he said later that he, too, thought it was a plane's taillight. He trained his binoculars on it. Like Gorman, he was unable to distinguish a shape near the light. Neither could another CIA man who was with him in the tower, a Fargo resident named Manuel E. Johnson. Up in the F-51, Gorman dived on the light, which was steadily blinking on and off. As I closed in, he told Project Saucerman later, it suddenly became steady and pulled up into a sharp left turn. It was a clear white and completely round about 6 to 8 inches in diameter. I thought it was making a pass at the tower. I dived after it and brought my manifold pressure up to 60, but I couldn't catch the thing. Gorman reported his speed at full power at 350 to 400 miles per hour. During the maneuvers that followed, both the CIA men watched from the tower. Jensen was using powerful night glasses, but still no shape was visible near the mysterious light. The fantastic dogfight continued for 20 minutes. Gorman described it in detail. When I attempted to turn with the light, I blacked out temporarily, owing to excessive speed. I am in fairly good physical condition. I don't believe there are many, if any, pilots who could withstand the turn and speed affected by the light and remain conscious. During these sharp maneuvers, the light climbed quickly, then made another left bank. I put my 51 into a sharp turn and tried to cut it off, said Gorman. But then we were at about 7,000 feet. Suddenly it made a sharp right turn and we headed straight at each other. Just when we were about to collide, I guess I lost my nerve. I went into a dive and the light passed over my canopy at about 500 feet. Then I made a left circle about 1,000 feet above and I gave chase again. When collision seemed imminent a second time, the object shot straight into the air. Gorman climbed after it at full throttle. Just about this time, 2 other witnesses, a private pilot and his passenger, saw the fast-moving light. The pilot was Dr. A.D. Cannon, an oculist. His passenger was Ian R. Nelson. Dr. Cannon later told investigators the light was moving at high speed. He thought it might be a Canadian jet fighter from over the border. After landing at the airport, Dr. Cannon and Mr. Nelson again watched the light, saw it change direction, and disappear. Meanwhile, Gorman was making desperate efforts to catch the thing. He was now determined to ram it, since there seemed nothing solid behind it to cause a dangerous crash. If his fighter was disabled or if it caught fire, he could bail out. But despite the F-51's fast climb, the light still outdistanced him. At 14,000 feet, Gorman's plane went into a power stall. He made one last try, climbing up to 17,000 feet. A few minutes later, the light turned into a north-northwest direction and quickly disappeared. Throughout the dogfight, Gorman noticed no deviation on his instruments, according to the Project Saucer report. Gorman did not confirm or deny this when I talked with him, but he did agree with the rest of the project statement. He did not notice any sound, odor, or exhaust trail. Gorman's remark about ramming the light reminded me of what Art Green had said. When I asked Gorman about the court-martial rumor, he gave me a searching glance. "Where did you hear that?" "Several places," I told him. "In Chicago and Salt Lake City. In fact, we've been hearing it all over." "Well, there's nothing to it," Gorman declared, and he changed the subject. Sometime afterward, a Fargo pilot told me there had been trouble over the ramming story. But it wasn't Gorman's fault. Someone else released that report to the AP. The news story didn't actually say there was an Air Force order to ram it, but the idea got around, and we heard that Washington squawked. Gorman had a pretty rough time of it for a while. Some of the newspapers razzed his story, and the Project Saucer teams really worked on him. I guess they were trying to scare him into saying he was mistaken, and it was a balloon. When I asked Gorman about this, he denied he'd have rough treatment by the project teams. Sure, they asked about 1,000 questions, and I could tell that they thought it might be a hoax at first, but that was before they quizzed the others who saw it. Anybody suggest it was a balloon? I said casually. At first they were sure that's what it was, answered Gorman. You see, there was a weather balloon released here. You know the kind that had a lighted candle on it. The project team said I chased after that candle just to imagine the light's maneuvers, confused it with my own movement because of the dark. Gorman grinned. They had it just about wrapped up until they talked to George Sanderson. He's a weather observer. He was tracking the balloon with a theodolite, and he showed them his records. The time and altitudes didn't fit, and the wind direction was wrong. The balloon was drifting in the opposite direction. Both tower men backed him up, so that killed the weather balloon idea. The next step by Project Saucer investigators had been to look for some unidentified aircraft. This failed too. Obviously, it was only routine. The outline of a conventional plane would have certainly have been seen by Gorman and the men in the tower. An astronomical check by Professor Hynek ruled out stars, fireballs, and comets. A vain hope to begin with. The only other conventional answer, as a project report later stated, was hallucination. In view of all the testimony, hallucination had to be ruled out. Finally, the investigators admitted they had no solution. The first Project Saucer report on April 27th of 1949 left the Gorman mystery light unidentified. In the Saturday Evening Post of May 7th of 1949, Sidney Shallot analyzed the Gorman case in the second of his articles on flying saucers. Shallot suggested the solution, that Gorman had chased one of the Navy's giant cosmic ray research balloons. Each of these balloons is lighted, so that night-flying planes would not collide with the gas bag or the instrument case suspended below. Shallot concluded that Gorman was suffering from a combination of vertigo and confusion with the light on the balloon. As already mentioned, these huge Navy balloons are filled with only a small amount of helium before they release at Minneapolis. Then they rise swiftly to very high altitudes, unless a leak develops. In Shallot's words, these balloons travel high and fast. Fargo is about 200 miles from Minneapolis. Normally, a cosmic ray research balloon would have reached a very high altitude by the time it had drifted this far. The only possible answer to its low-altitude sighting would be a serious leak. If a leaking balloon had come down to 1,000 feet at Fargo, it would either have remained at that height or kept on descending. The mystery light was observed at this altitude moving at high speed. If a Cub's outline was visible against a lighted football field, the massive shape of even a partly deflated balloon would have stood out like an elephant. Even before release, the partially inflated gas bags are almost 100 feet tall. The crowd at the football game would certainly have seen such a monstrous shape above the glare of the floodlights, for the plastic balloons gleam brightly in any light rays. The two CAA men watching with binoculars could not have possibly missed this. For the cosmic balloon answer to be correct, this leaking gas bag would have had to rise swiftly to 17,000 feet. After a loss of helium had forced it down to 1,000. As a balloon pilot, I know this is impossible. The Project Saucer report said unequivocally. The object could outturn and outspeed the F-51, and was able to attain a much steeper climb, and to maintain a constant rate of climb far in excess of the Air Force fighter. A leaking balloon? More and more I became convinced that Secretary Forrestal had persuaded some editors that it was their patriotic duty to conceal the answer, whatever it was. That thought had begun to worry me, because of my part in this investigation. Perhaps John Steele had been right, and we shouldn't be trying to dig out the answer. But I had already told Purdy, and he had agreed, that if national security was involved, we would drop the thing completely. By the time I had proved the balloon answer wrong, I was badly puzzled. The idea of a disembodied light was the hardest thing to swallow that I'd come across so far. And yet there were other light reports. A strange sighting at Fairfield's Susan Field, the weird green lights at Las Vegas and Albuquerque, and there was the encounter that Lieutenant H.G. Combs had one night above Andrews Field near Washington, D.C. This incident had occurred on November 18th of 1948, 6 weeks after Gorman's experience. Combs, flying with another lieutenant named Jackson, was about to land his T-6 at 9:45 p.m., when a strange object loomed up near him. It looked like a grayish globe, and it gave off an odd, fuzzy light. Combs chased the weird object for over 10 minutes, during which it appeared to evade every move he made. Once, its speed was nearly 600 miles an hour, as closely as he could estimate. In a final attempt to identify it, Combs zoomed the Team 6 up at a steep angle and flashed his landing lights on it. Before he could get a good look, the globe light whirled off to the east and vanished. Since Combs' story had been in the newspapers, Project Saucer evidently had felt it wise to give some explanation. When I read it in the preliminary report, I was amazed. Here was the concluding sentence. The mystery was cleared up when the object was identified positively as a cluster of cosmic ray research balloons. Even one of the giant balloons would have been hard to take as an explanation. Combs was almost sure to have collided with it in his head-on passes. But an entire cluster. I tried to picture the T-6 zooming and twisting through the night sky with several huge balloons in its path. It would be a miracle if Combs got through without hitting one of them, even if each balloon was lighted. But he had only seen one light. So had Lieutenant Jackson. That would mean all the rest of the balloons were unlighted, an unbelievable coincidence. It was not until months afterwards that I found Project Saucer had withdrawn this solution. In its final report, this case, number 207, was listed in the unidentified group. How the balloon cluster explanation ever got into the first report is still a mystery. When I talked with Gorman, I told him I was baffled by the idea of a light maneuvering through the skies, with no airfoil to support it. "I know," he said. "It got me too at first." "You mean you know the answer?" I demanded. "It's just my personal opinion," said Gorman. "But I'd rather not have it printed. You see, I got some ideas from all the questions these project teams asked me. If my hunch turns out to be right, I might be talking about an official secret." I tried to pry some hint out of him, but Gorman just smiled and shook his head. "I can tell you this much," he said, "because it's been mentioned in print. There was thought behind every move the lot made. It wasn't any radar-responder gadget making it veer away from my ship." "How do you know that?" "Because it reacted differently at different times. If it had been a mechanical control, it would have turned or climbed the same way each time I got near it. Instead, it was as if some intelligent mind was directing every turn like a game of chess, and always one move ahead of me. Maybe you can figure out the rest." That was all I could get out of him. It bothered me, because Combs' report indicated the same thing. I had a strong temptation to skip the space plan's research and tell Rettel what Gorman had told me. But Rettel had an orderly mind, and he didn't like to be pushed. Reluctantly, I gave up the idea. I had a feeling Rettel knew the answer to the mystery lights, and it wasn't easy to put off the solution. The letter that came from Art Green while I was working on the space plans didn't make it easier. "Dear Kehoe, just heard about your Seattle visit. That fear-filled Susan thing is on the level. Several Air Force pilots have told me about it. When you get to Fargo, ask Gorman what they found when they checked his ship with a Geiger counter. If he says he was negative, then he must be under orders. I happen to know better. Yours, Art Green."
Thank you for listening to part 2 of The Flying Saucers Are Real. Join us next week for part 3, only on the Hidden Corners.